One, and we're live.
Okay, friends, I'm Joe Chuman, and I'd like to invite you to another interview as part of our ongoing author interview series under the aegis of the Puffin Cultural Forum in Teaneck, New Jersey. Let me begin by introducing myself. I'm Joseph Chuman. I'm a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture and also a professor of human rights at Columbia University. And I think we're going to have a very intriguing, and I can guarantee a different interview this morning on a different type of work that I found actually inspiring. As a lifelong activist, it really put a new slant on political activism, which of course today is more necessary than ever. So what I'd like to do is just give you by name the authors whom we're speaking to today. And what I want to do is ask them to basically introduce themselves in terms of their history of activism and art. I should mention to begin that we're interviewing Steve Duncombe and Steve Lampert, two Steves, got to keep them apart, okay, on their book called The Art of Activism. Here it is, subtitled Your All-Purpose Guide to Making the Impossible Possible. And I should say this book is itself a work of art, very richly illustrated, okay? It is, in effect, an exemplification of what it's talking about in a way that is graphic and very intriguing. So let me start with Steve Lampert. Both of you work with the Center for Artistic Activism. So maybe you can tell us about the center, but I'm really interested primarily in what your backgrounds are and your backgrounds in both activism and art. So why don't we start with Steve Lampert? Steve, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I think both Steve and I came from kind of radical religious families. Mine might have been a little less religious than Steve's. My parents, once they quit the church, they were completely done. And so I wasn't raised with it, but I was kind of raised with the values. And fast forwarding to, I was in art school, after drifting around quite a bit. And both at the beginning and the end of my time in art school, I had two different illegal evictions in San Francisco as a tenant. And so I got really familiar with gentrification and the tenants law and stuff. And towards the end of my time at art school, like I would go to art school and then to the San Francisco Superior Court, where I was representing myself as a defendant against one of the most powerful landlord attorneys in the city, and just terrified, and really understood the stakes in this very real way. But then the art school just seemed completely irrelevant, and at the same time, I really liked doing art and I was good at it. And that became like the beginning of this quest to or really necessity of figuring out how to put the two together. And about 10 years later, I met Steve and I thought he might have some ideas.
And at that time, I was looking for answers as well. I came out of an activist background. I grew up in an activist family. My father was a radical minister. What Steve left out about his family was his father was an ex-monk and his mother was an ex-nun. So I think he, at least in the heritage part, you might have outdone me. But I come from a long line of ministers. And my father was a civil rights activist. He helped organize the Second Selma March. And so I grew up around politics, and I was an activist since I was about 18 years old. And I was organizing these big protests, including the big protest down in Washington. And I didn't even want to go to the protests that I was organizing. They were boring. They were kind of repetitions of what had happened 10 years before in the Vietnam War, 10 years before that in the civil rights movement. And it seemed kind of rote. And each time we did it, we had sort of diminishing returns. And so I was looking for some ways to think about how to do activism more creatively. And again, at that moment, ACT UP was in formation, and they were bringing ideas from the advertising industry, from the art world into their protests. And it got me very excited, but I really needed a partner in all of this. And so I met Steve and he's like, I'm from art school. I'm a practicing artist. And I was like, he's going to have all the answers. And what we found out really quickly is neither of us had the answers. But what we did do is we had a lot of questions. And so what we started to do is we started interviewing artists that were mixing art with activism and activists that were mixing art into their activism and asking them what they were doing and how did they know if it worked or not. And that was the beginning of the Center for Artistic Activism, which we formed about 12 years ago.
Yeah, where are you based?
New York, except like everything else, Steve lives upstate. I live in Manhattan. The third member of our team, the core director team, lives even further upstate. So we exist.
And we have employees scattered across the globe now.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I have a series of questions I wrote up, but I sort of want to preempt them with a more generic question that comes to mind. When you talk about the fusion of art and activism, when I think of art, maybe it's my experience way back when I was in college with artists and getting to know them. One could argue that a lot of activists are apolitical or politically quietistic. In other words, they're into their art and so on. Don't bother me with politics. I'm not into that. And yet, of course, your book is premised on the notion that politics or political activism is enriched and inspired and propelled by an artistic sensibility and artistic infusion. And I'm wondering whether artists in politics indeed reflect a minor voice, whether they are a tradition and the artists that you come up with basically are immune to or allergic to or have no political sensibility at all, and they don't want to get involved, or if they have political ideas, they're crazy ideas. And in effect, they tend to be in an ethereal universe of their own into their art, and politics represents a type of mundane sort of activity which they want to have nothing to do with. So I'm wondering whether you, broadly speaking, find that artists who want to be invested in politics, and of course your politics are a progressive politics, not a conservative politics or a reactionary politics or an evil politics, whether you find artists who are inclined towards politics reflecting a type of minor tradition or a minor voice among artists, or whether you're happily find that lots of artists are sort of latent political activists and you can sort of stimulate their sensibilities in that direction.
I think the people that that we attract those kinds of folks. So asking us if it seems like a minor group, we wouldn't have the perspective. It's most of the people that we encounter. But the separation that you're talking about, I think, is part of the institutions of art and activism that are really unnatural, and it takes a whole lot of effort to separate that. And in a large part, they're successful because when I was in art school, I was in classes with untold numbers of other students, and not all of them thought that they could have an impact on culture, even though they were making culture, right? They didn't think of themselves as able to do that. What they were taught, or either directly or indirectly, was that you reflect, you show a perspective, and then what people do with it is up to them, and even how they interpret the artwork, as if we make these things that people are meant to free associate and just look at and have no intention at all or trying to communicate. But one of the things that I did learn from Steve is when we started to go back through history, and he really looked at this closely, is that art and activism have always gone together, and that separating them actually is what's difficult. So
that's
Steve,
good to know. And in some ways, obviously, that's a thesis of your book. It's a premise in your book, which I found very engaging. Okay, can I have several questions. Can you explain why it's critical to basically, from your point of view, marry art to activism? What, in effect, does art do to activism? And your whole book obviously is an exposition or an elaboration of that premise, but maybe you can just start us off with some basic ideas as to why you think art is necessary for activism to be effective.
Sure. I think the way to think about it is not think about art in terms of a painting on a wall,
Mhm.
but an artistic approach. And I think that you mentioned that before, Joe, is it's really about bringing an artistic approach in. But what art does is it mobilizes affect, feeling, and emotions. And you talk to any activist, and they'll tell you a story about how they got involved. They
Mhm.
didn't get involved by reading a white paper. They didn't get involved by, going to a press conference. That usually was some sort of experiential, highly emotional experience that drew them into some sort of political activism. It can be rage, it can be pride, it can be growing up in a family where your parents are activism, and those are the stories around your dining room table. And so one of the things that we found is that in terms of communication strategies, traditional and conventional activism forms often just speak to the head. They're very much based around the idea of cognition and rationality and reason, which is great. We want to live in a rational universe, right? On the other hand, to get people moved, to get people motivated, we need to be able to speak to their emotions, and we need to be able to combine the two. And so what we're really trying to do is take the sort of affect of the artistic approach and marry it to the effect of activism, and have this sort of, is both emotionally charged, but very importantly, not just stay at that place, move towards having some sort of material impact on powers and structures and policies.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we're not merely cerebral creatures, although, of course, I've known a lot of activists who have this sort of, I guess, intellectual view of justice and injustice, and they lose sight of the fact of what you're talking about. That people are primarily moved by emotions. I mean, you can read your David Hume, and he'll tell you that that it's not reason alone that basically moves us. That unless our ideas are fueled by emotions, they become sterile and inert, and we need that. And art, of course, speaks to the emotion. So I think it's right. Now, you coined an interesting word at the very beginning of the book. What is it? Right? It's affect. Right, which is a conjoined term, a portmanteau word. What is affect? Can you tell us what?
I'm going to let Steve
Joe,
answer that one.
Yeah, we pronounce it affect.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No,
Right.
well,
It's not affect or effect. It's affect.
well, except our
Affect.
Scandinavian friends who we work with call it affect. So we go with affect. But Steve, why don't you tell the story about?
So Steve Duncombe was like saying that, that these things need to go together, and that, I think he'd just been around NYU for a really long time and came up with this effective affect and affective effect. And it took me months just to be able to say that, and I still jumbled it up just there. But yeah, after a while, I was like, this is good. It was sort of funny, but I was like, we need something simpler. And I was like, what about that key that I accidentally hit on the keyboard every once in a while that has A and E together, And we were like, yeah. So then we got to coin our own term, affect, which is the combination of the emotional power of arts with the outcome sort of centered focus of activism.
And you know what's useful about it?
Has it reached the Merriam-Webster dictionary yet? Or
it will. It will.
Yeah.
Okay. But what it is kind of a joke. But what's useful about it is it reminds us. It's like it's just a little kind of thing that says, whenever we plan an action or we work with people that are planning actions, we always think to ourselves, is it working on an affective level, and is it working on an effective level?
Mm-hmm.
And really thinking about that it has to work on both levels, or it isn't doing the job it can do.
Right. No, I understand. I think that's critical. Okay. What I enjoyed reading was the, moving from the ideas, and you have plenty of ideas. I mean, there's some philosophical truths in the book, which I found engaging because I come out of a philosophical background academically. But what I found most engaging were the actual concrete examples you gave, including historical ones. And we're not talking about art as the painting on the wall, but as what you're calling a much broader artistic approach. And you gave us some examples. I'm wondering if for our viewers, you can just sort of mine history in the last several decades and basically elaborate for us what some of the examples, some of them notoriously successful examples of social change activism which combine this type of artistic sensibility. You give some examples that I thought were impressive. Can you just rehearse some of those for us now?
Kind of our go-to is actually the civil rights movement, the U.S. civil rights movement.
Okay.
Often because how it's taught is about individuals of moral, righteous courage who one day just said, enough is enough, and got into the streets. And sort of the classic is the image of Rosa Parks,
Right.
who's sitting on the bus seat, and the tired seamstress who just wanted to stay in her seat and refused to go to the back of the bus, as was custom in law in the South, and thereby triggered the civil rights movement. She was tired. She was a seamstress. As we all know, probably who are watching this, she was also the secretary of the NAACP.
Right.
She was a committed activist, and she committed that act knowing full well what it was going to do. It was a performance. And that image that we all see, that image was a staged image.
Yes.
A year later, the white man behind her in the wide shot, that's a reporter.
Right.
None of that is to say that this isn't true. But the civil rights movement were masters at making the invisible visible, because that was the problem with the civil rights movement. And actually the problem with a lot of activism is that the injustices happen elsewhere. They happen when the sun goes down, or they happen on a timeline in which you can't see them, things like the environmental and climate change. And so what activists have done, like the civil rights movement, is crystallize those into performances which can be imaged and a story can be told. And then that image and story can be reproduced and spread around the world, which is exactly
That's a great
what happened.
example. Actually, I can verify that. There's a wonderful woman who lives right here in Teaneck, New Jersey, who was in Montgomery and was part of the bus boycott and had dinner. Martin Luther King was a guest at her family's table, and she knew Rosa Parks was involved, and indeed verifies that that's absolutely correct, that it was not spontaneous, that it was actually a planned situation. And I think you mentioned in your book, and this is well known, there had been actually a prior incident of a younger woman, in effect, who was also basically removed from a bus, and the NAACP, or the civil rights leaders at that point, chose not to use that case because of the profile and the background of that young woman. They thought Rosa Parks was much better situated as a actor, as a character, as a performer, as a person in that situation. So that it was really quite orchestrated in that regard, quite well orchestrated. That was. Any other examples you want to give us?
Steve, you gotta say one of our favorites on the other side.
Yeah. So Steve's, the examples, we went further and further back, and they actually go back thousands of years.
We start with Moses, actually, when we do our workshops. We do Moses, Jesus, and the Prophet Muhammad.
Well, can you get away from Charlton Heston? Or
no, we actually, the funny thing is, we use Charlton Heston's films.
Yes, I saw that sort of drawing in there. I said it looked a lot like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, back in the day.
Yeah.
But Steve, you want to talk about Alfredo Jarre?
Oh, yeah. So Alfredo is an architect and an artist who's well known for, his political artworks, and I think very committed to bringing things to light that aren't out in the world. But, whenever you're a successful artist, you get invited to go to, festivals in other countries and stuff. It's part of the success. And so he got invited to go to this town called Skoghall, Sweden, and do an artwork there. And they gave him a tour of the town, and it's like, a logging town, and they make paper. And so they have these massive logs and huge rolls of paper. And then they show him the factory, they show him, the gym, the library, the supermarket, and all of these are owned by the company because there's no other reason to live in this town. It's the only game in town. So they built the whole city, and he's like, okay, great. And they're very proud of all the things that they've provided the workers and their families. And Alfredo says, well, where's the museum? And they said, oh, we don't have a museum. That's why we bring artists in, as a way. And he's like, okay, well, I'm an architect. I'm going to design you a museum, and we're going to build it out of the paper and the logs that you have, that you make these materials with. And so they built this huge museum and then invited people in the town to show their artwork there. So everyone came, and there's a big ceremony when they opened it up. But it also said right at the front door, it was the 24-hour museum. And they started asking, oh, is this going to be open all night? And he's like, no, it's called the 24-hour museum because at the end of 24 hours, they're going to light it on fire. And take out all the artwork first, of course. And the people there were like, no. We like this. Like, why would you burn it down? And he's like, that's the project. Sorry. And so they go to the mayor and they say, hey, we talked to the artist. He's got this weird idea that he's going to burn this thing down at the end of 24 hours. And the mayor says, yeah, that's the project. And so they go to the fire department and say, hey, the mayor and this artist, they've lost their minds because they are going to burn this thing down tomorrow. And you're the fire department. You have to stop them. And they said, no, that's not going to happen. We're the fire department. We're lighting it on fire. And so at the end of 24 hours, they took all the people's artwork out and everyone was there, in the town square, and they lit it on fire and burned it down. And now Alfredo goes back home. And 6 weeks later, he gets a call from the mayor saying, the people here have organized and they've kept at it and they've kept talking and they've decided they want a permanent museum and they want you to be the one that designs it.
Right.
And it was the first time people had organized themselves, because this is a social democracy and it's a company town, not in the West Virginia sense of the company town, but in the social democratic sense of a company town. And so they had never actually organized themselves and demanded anything. And so what Alfredo Jarre did was he created desire and he stimulated a social movement. And we asked him, how did you know it was going to work? And he said, I didn't. Most of my stuff fails. And that's key about this stuff.
I did want to ask you about that. One thing, there are a lot of little chestnuts in your book throughout, and I've caught them. And there's something very humane about your book. And it basically promotes for the artist activist an element of self-acceptance, an acknowledgement that failure very often is a component of what we try to do. We're fallible creatures, and art has a type of sort of open-ended experimental element to it. So failure is going to be part of it. And you just say, I picked this out of your book, you take a very self-accepting approach to failure. And that caught my imagination because I think we all fail. And, as I've often said to myself as an activist, that injustice seems to be infinite, but our resources are just finite, meaning there's always more injustice to combat and we can never really, perhaps thoroughly overcome it. We can have, success in the near range in terms of our objectives, but, look at the war in Ukraine. It's just overwhelming and so forth. So I want you to talk a little bit about that notion of self-acceptance, self-appreciation within the context of failure, within the context of your approach of artistic activism in a way. I was struck by that because it seemed very tolerant of the human condition and your philosophy of what it means to be human and to be an activist in a world in which injustice seems to thrive. I was wondering if you could say something about that. There's no more to be said, but I just was moved by that.
I would say two things. One is that I give this example to people, if I took a viola and you never played the viola before and handed it to you in a sheet of music and said, I want you to study the music and study the viola, but you can't play it. And then I want you to pick it up and play the music perfectly. It's impossible, right? You need the time to experiment with it and play and practice, right? Mm-hmm. And to do anything creative, you can't just say, I'm only going to make masterpieces. Yeah. And yet, a lot of the organizations we talk to, the way that they organize in this way. They come up with a plan, and for a march or an action or whatever it is, it's 3 months out. They organize all around it. They do not plan for any kind of setback. At most, maybe if there's rain, there's another date or something. But if anything goes wrong, that's not part of the plan. And they put everything into this one action. And then at the end, just sort of rationalize how that was successful, right? No matter what happens. Well, at least we had this number of people, or at least, this happened. And I think in order both to be really successful, it requires you to honestly assess what you're doing, but also not put that kind of pressure on yourself or a group, right? And to experiment and practice and to make things an iteration and lower the stakes and do them more often instead of larger, and things like that. But Steve, what am I missing?
No, I think one of the great things I've learned working with Steve, who's an artist, is the idea of sketches and iteration. that you don't sit down and paint the masterpiece. We did a little research into Guernica because we talk about Guernica. Picasso did 47 versions of it before he finally did it. And right before he finished, he actually changed a whole bunch of stuff, right? And approaching things as, oh, I'm going to do a sketch and then I'm going to see if it works. Maybe I'll show it to some people, see what they think, and then do it better, and then do it again, and do it again, and do it again. It was really liberating for me. And I think it's a great lesson from an artistic approach to activism for activists to think about what they're doing as sketches, reflection, iteration, and again.
Right. You're not going to conquer the world in a single demonstration.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, let's go back to the civil rights movement. Okay.
Well, I did want to talk about that. I mean, you list a whole range going back to Jesus. You bring in
Moses. We actually,
right.
in the
Moses
book
is earlier, of course.
Yeah.
Jesus, and then you talk about the jump to the American Revolution, the civil rights movement, which was chock full of that sort of thing. Rosa Parks. You talk about the Black Panther Party and their costuming. Okay, and clearly they were really powerful dudes. I mean, I remember I knew Black Panthers, not very closely, but I knew them. You know, the movement. I met some. And then you talk about the various stages of the feminist movement as being able to use theater and so forth to win certain things. And then, of course, Act Up, which was later, and Larry Kramer, who was a playwright, certainly had, that was very artistically generated. I wonder if you could say somewhere, some of the things you leave out, though. I mean, I'm a child of the 60s, so I sort of wax nostalgic about these things, but there was a great deal of theater on the left. I mean, you don't include Abby Hoffman levitating the Pentagon, okay, and that I was looking for that. That did not come up. That was the sort of theater of the absurd. I mean, it was really, I mean, Abby Hoffman himself was, you know, if you want to be slightly critical, was a type of leftist clown. I mean, his life was a type of,
we don't say that it's critical, though.
A type of theater in a way, you know, that attracted, and also someone more serious whom I did know, but not well, was Bill Kunstler, who was in effect the dean of left-wing lawyers. I mean, no one was too radical or too basically despised or hated for Bill Kunstler. And he was a type of charismatic figure. I mean, the way he wore his hair and his eyeglasses were always, and so on. It was a type of persona that went beyond the law that was, for many people on the left, extremely attractive and very effective. He was a powerful figure, Bill was. And, you know, he's not the only one, but he was the most flamboyant, I think, of those lawyers. And so there was a type of artistic way in which Bill Kunstler presented himself to the world and so on. And, you know, the yuppie movement and the yippie movement and so on had a very theatrical element, and the whole phenomenon of street theater and so on that came out of that, you know, milieu was big in the 60s. So. Yeah.
I mean, Abby Hoffman is a ghost which haunts the entire book, and I think we do quote him at one point.
I know that in an earlier draft I did have an illustration of him, so he was in it, and there was some reason.
We have a slideshow which could go for 10 hours about different histories, and we just pulled out a couple here and there. But I think, you know, one of the ways to look at this is that, and this is the practice that we do when we work with other activists and artists, when we go around the world, is say, look back at your own histories and now look at them with an artistic perspective and pull out the artistic elements. And so we were working, for example, in East Africa, and the group looked at the Mau Mau movement and found all of these artistic, performative sort of tactics which the Mau Mau movement was using in the war against the British Empire. And so what we would say is like, yeah, we left out so much. And actually, anytime you look at any successful activism with the right perspective, you're going to say, that's creative. Oh, wow, that's a really interesting performance. You know, William Kunstler, why was he so good? Yes, he was a sharp lawyer. He had his, you know, someone writing good briefs for him, but he was a showman. I mean, that's what he was.
Right. Yeah. Well, the other thing that we'll talk about often when we're teaching is the Diggers, which were a theater group that decided to move out of the theater. And I growing up in San Francisco, like that was sort of part of the history, the Black Panthers, all that stuff was like I just thought was normal. But the Diggers, you know, started the first free medical clinic. They gave away food on the streets. Like the medical clinic became the Haight-Ashbury free clinic, and that distributed out to most other free clinics in the world. the free food became food not bombs. The free concerts in the park became any concert in the park that's not a symphony that you've ever seen. Like their ideas disseminated and changed how we think about so many things, and like literally the lives and health of a ton of people. And it all came from like and food co-ops too actually came from them. So they had this idea for a sort of social art project, or like doing more with theater, and the ramifications were huge. And yet, again, going back to the first question, is like so many artists don't recognize the power that they have. All you have to do is look back at the movements like that.
Right, but that brings a sort of. I want to ask you a question. I mean, ultimately, politics to be successful has to be efficacious. I mean, we're interested in changing structures, institutions, realities, changing minds, but changing the minds of people who have the power to do that. Let's call them political leaders, legislators, executives who hold office in government, who can change laws and so on, that reform society for the better. I guess the question I have is, how do you draw the linkage in the minds of people potentially between the artistic manifestation that you're putting out there and motivating them to actually do the legwork, the grunt work, the hard work, the less glamorous stuff, okay, that you want them to do in order to try to lobby for or leverage that type of practical change? There's got to be some sort of linkage between the artistic display and performance. You don't want people, I think, to get lost in it, to say, gee, that was beautiful street theater, and go home and turn on the TV set or go to sleep. You want them to, in effect, do something with that. So the question is, how can you try to ensure that the artistic inspiration doesn't die in place, but is efficacious in terms of stimulating the grunt work that has to be done in order to basically change policy or change the minds of office holders who hold the power?
Steve, you want to jump into that? That's yours.
Yeah. So, I mean, that you called it grunt work is, I think, a great example. I think a lot of people that work in big organizations, and even big and small, actually, maybe more so in small, feel like the work that they're doing is joyless, right? It's organizing a meeting, get a bunch of people together, scheduling phone calls, looking over legislation, like this kind of probably exhausting stuff. And the smaller the organization, the more that lands on one person, right? And then that's kind of all it is, right? And then on the weekend, they're looking for an outlet that can bring some energy back to them for the following week of this hard work, right? Mm-hmm. And so they go out dancing, they throw a dinner party, they take up a hobby in order to bring some vitality back to their life. Now, what we're proposing is not to get rid of the grunt work, but to incorporate both, right? Like that we have to be full and complete people. That if you work in a big organization, that stuff that you do on the weekends to revitalize yourself can be incorporated into this work. And that's what helps prevent burnout, right? Is like when you're trying to be for 40 hours a week, like not a full human and like this, laborer or something, but to bring that creativity into the work. I don't think it's so much of a problem of maybe motivating artists to actually do the steps. When you give people the structure to say, okay, think about how you change behavior. How are we going to do that? And it's kind of a fun project. The grunt work is less tedious, and you have this bigger vision that you're working towards that's really exciting, that can make that grunt work more tolerable.
Yeah. Although, and I was surprised, Steve, you're usually the much more cynical one about this. I'll be the more cynical one. I think there is a danger within artistic activism of you go do the performance and the world's going to change. Right. I put up my poster. Why hasn't anything happened? And so we insist when we work with artists that they think about the work that they do as part of a campaign. not as a tactic. One of the problems is what we call tactical myopia, in which everything becomes about the tactic. Even when we discussed our examples, we talked about a burning of a museum or sitting down on the bus. We didn't talk about all the organizing that came before that, all the organizing that came after that. And so what we try to do is, when working with artists, is really get them to think about, one, working in concert with on-the-ground organizations, but also take their own interventions in terms of a long-term campaign. And that means, and there's a chapter in this book, which is about, what are your objectives? How does one objective lead to another objective? How can you think about your artistic interventions as a tactic? How is that tactic linked to bringing about the objective? And it's really wonky stuff, but as Steve says, we find that actually artists find it liberating, because all of a sudden it's like, you mean I don't have to solve everything with my one piece, which of course never solved anything. And so it gives them kind of a roadmap to start thinking about the process of being an artistic activist.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, and this gets slightly more analytical, but it caught my attention, about the role of culture. You talk a lot about culture, high culture, pop culture, generic culture. What is the place of culture within the artistic political endeavor?
So, culture is one of those words that we use and it means a lot of things. So one of the things we try to do is define different ways of thinking about culture. And the sort of the two primary ones we think about is terms of culture as representation, or capital C culture, and then culture as sort of lived expression, or as an anthropologist might see culture. And we try to talk about the connection between the two, that how we live our lives in part is based on the idealized representations that we see, we hear, and inspire us. And in turn, those idealized representations are created out of our lived experiences. So you can think of sort of a chicken, egg, chicken, egg, chicken, egg, chicken, egg. Why we spend so much time talking about culture is because it is the foundational material of which artistic activism is working. Just as this is a book about legal activism, law would be the fundamental sort of building block. Or if we were writing a book for sculptors, maybe clay. But artistic activists have to work with culture. And not only do they work within a culture, but they produce culture. They work within culture with a small c, and then produce culture with a capital C, hoping to influence culture with a small c. And so they really need to think about the culture in which they're working. And so one of the things that happens immediately when we go around the world is tell people, when we do these examples, the first thing we say is, these will not work for you. Why will they not work for you? Because context matters. That Alfredo Jar's intervention had everything to do with social democracy in Sweden, in this one town. You burn a museum in New York City, and you're just going to burn a museum. And so, the culture in which people are operating, this particular culture, is key to successful artistic activism. The signs, symbols, and stories, they're different depending on time period, population, right, where you are.
In other words, what you're doing has to make sense.
Exactly. That's the nice, easy way of saying it.
Right.
Exactly. And literally make sense.
Right. Yeah. Now, just to take that one step further, it caught my attention because I read Clifford Geertz, the noted anthropologist in graduate school. And I sort of like this. You say you have to weave, he said you have to weave new webs of significance.
Yes.
And in some ways, you're trying to bank yourself on the culture, but in a sense, extending the culture, weaving the culture a little bit further to extend the significance. I think that's what you're doing to maybe generate new understandings. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on Geertz's observation.
Sure. So I read Geertz in graduate school too, and I actually I love Geertz. And Geertz's, his famous quote is, "Culture is the webs of significance which we weave ourselves in, but ourselves are entrapped within." And what's interesting about the work that we're trying to do is, on the one hand, we're trying to work within the culture of any given society. For example, getting people to tell stories as opposed to just putting forth facts. And one of the best ways to tell stories is to be a good listener to those stories which are being told around you, so you can fit your story into their story. But the problem is that it recreates the culture even as it shifts it ever so slightly. And so one of the things that we've been really influenced by, and this is a standard tactic of the avant-garde, is surprise. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk a little bit about
that was
the
my
power of
next
surprise.
question. I wanted to talk to you about the element of surprise, which you focus on. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, so I guess I could give an example of I'm not a very good museum or gallery goer, because when I go into museums, I look at something, I kind of don't understand it, and I go, oh, well, it's a painting I don't understand, and I just keep going, you know. And they've done studies in museums where the amount of time people will spend in front of an artwork is below 10 seconds, you know, like on average. Because I have a way of classifying it as art, and I can move on, right? I know what it is, and I know I don't understand it. But if you took any of those artworks in a museum and like put them in my bedroom overnight while I was asleep, and then I woke up, I would be like, well, what is this thing? Who made it? What is it trying to tell me? What does it mean? How is it made? How did it get here? All the questions that I should be asking in a museum, but I don't. And the difference is the element of surprise, right? So when we introduce surprise, we get a window where people are trying to make sense of something, right? The unexpected happens and they're like, what is happening? Who is this? What does this mean, right? And that's a way that we can break out of these other patterns of thinking. And artists, you know, this is doing something sort of unusual, is like first year stuff, you know, so it comes really naturally, but it needs to both be surprising and then also legible within the culture, within, you know, for that audience. If you make something that's just too weird, people actually don't see it, they dismiss it. But yeah, that element of surprise and weaving it, I think, within some cultural symbols, but still a little confusing, a little bit unexpected. That's how we learn, right? Like we come across something that we've never encountered before and we try to make sense of it. And so surprise is really key for people to change their minds and to learn new things.
And I just want to jump on that for a second. Steve talked about an art that shows up in his bedroom. Well, I think the equivalent for me is a protest. I see a protest on the street. Yeah. I'm like, oh, protest. And maybe I support the cause, maybe I don't, but I've already figured out what it is, right? Our ideal is to make protests that don't look like protests.
That show up in people's bedrooms overnight.
Right. And one of the examples that we use here is actually in China, where environmentalists, because you can't protest in China, for example, these environmentalists created a war on smog, which they borrowed a slogan from President Xi. And they didn't hold a protest because that would get them arrested, because it would be identified as a protest. Instead, they wore gas masks and had a little dance recital, or wore gas masks and then had a marriage ceremony. And it made people go, oh, wait, I know what this is. Wait, I don't know what that is. What is this about? And it's that moment, as Steve pointed out, that we can start to sort of remap people's cognitive patterns.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, marvelous. Okay, let's move from that to something that has a different sensibility. You talk about, you invoke basically marketing examples, that we can learn something from marketing. And that was an element of surprise for me, because clearly, implicitly and somewhat explicitly, you reveal yourselves to be dissatisfied with capitalism, right? And yet I think of marketing as being the mainstay of capitalism. Without marketing, we wouldn't create new needs, and without new needs, we wouldn't be able to enable capitalism to flourish. And yet you're open-minded enough to basically go to the adversarial camp and see what you can learn from the marketing world in order to change minds productively in the direction which you choose to do so. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what indeed artistic activists can learn from the marketing world, and how to hitch it on to their own ambitions.
Yeah, I think that marketing is like the most familiar form of mass communication that we have, because it's connection with capitalism. And what that means is that there's been a ton of investment in it. You know, some of the most creative people go into that field. And there's also a tremendous amount of testing, both prior to a campaign is released and then also when a campaign is released. You get to see another example of something that has worked or doesn't work, but more often works. Like, you know, every ad you see on TV, they wouldn't run it if it wasn't working, right? The Energizer Bunny is still around after 40 years because it works, right? Whether or not I like it, it works. So there's all these lessons that we can learn from that. And, you know, we try to help people. And I think Steve and I have the credentials of not being into advertising, a long list of them. But yeah, there's still a ton that you can learn from it, like how people change their behaviors and how you can figure out how to understand them, right? So me as a young activist in San Francisco, you know, thinking about housing and stuff, my sort of assumption is like, we put all this stuff out there and most people don't care, or there needs to be some sort of baseline education for them to understand it. And that idea takes root, and then you become really cynical and you start to resent the people that you're trying to help, right? Because they're apathetic, they're uneducated, or they're just sort of willfully, they're cowards, whatever, right? Like they're not getting involved. What friends of mine that worked in advertising taught me was like, you have to start with the assumption that everyone is smart and they have reasons, right? And that your job is to understand their reasons and to come up with something that will motivate them or addresses their hesitations, right? And when you start thinking about it that way, it's like, oh, people aren't showing up at this event not because they think that, you know, football is better and more important and they're going to watch the football game on Sunday. It might be because they can't remember where it is, or like they forgot, or that they don't understand how it connects to their life, or they didn't understand what you were asking them to do. Like there's a ton of reasons that you can dig into and figure out to improve that and make it more successful.
Yeah. Well, one example that you elaborate on that I really like, because I'm a bicyclist and bicycle enthusiast, you use that as the example.
Yeah.
How to take Nick, the average middle American who has no love of bicycling whatsoever. It's totally alien to his SUV culture and who he is, and how to slowly basically create an environment where he can change his mind to become bicycle friendly. I was wondering if you could just run through that and the stages of how we convert Nick from being someone hostile to bicycling or alien to it to someone who jumps on his bicycle and is now getting himself into shape.
Yeah. I'm glad you like that.
Commuting to work, leaving his SUV in the garage and commuting to work by bike. I was intrigued by it because I love the bicycle and
right. Yeah. We figured it was like the least controversial, where you could just be like, all right, I understand this and figure out how to apply it. But yeah, so there's sort of these early steps. There's 12 of them. I won't go into all of them, but I'll kind of group them together, right? So people need to move through several stages as they change their mind. This isn't necessarily our research. We adapted it from public health and sociology and things like that, but they move through multiple steps. You don't just like one day decide I'm going to ride my bike to work after driving this Chevy Suburban for 10 years, right? That there's a process that they go through, and it takes a long time. But knowing what that process is, there introduces all these opportunities as an activist to like do something that moves people. So the early stages are sort of getting the information in front of people and having them understand it. And to me, that was like, right. Of course, this is what I learned in art school, right? Like how you make something that gets people's attention and have them read it, the message that you're trying to send, right? But then beyond that, there's kind of all the things that happen after that need to get them to do something, right? So in the Center for Artistic Activism, we talk a lot about think, feel, do. So you definitely want someone to think about the issue, but you also want to think about what you want them to feel about it, and then what action that you want them to take. So we don't want to just inform people about issues and then walk away, because that is how people also become sort of cynical and apathetic, because they just learn how awful everything is and there's no action they can take. So the next stage is moving them towards that action, and that can be through like reminders, other kinds of support, instructions, and like you're saying, creating these opportunities for them to move through and get to the behavior. But then there's the third part is after the behavior, which is like supporting it and having them become like where this is a part of who they are instead of just like, oh yeah, I went to a protest once, right? That's great. But what we want is people who are part of the movement and like continue to work on it. And so how do we do that? And thinking about the different steps that people need to move through, I think makes for stronger action, stronger work.
Okay. Yeah, well, let me follow up on that with something which I think is very current to the moment in terms of trying to influence people and change perhaps their values on things. You say, quote, instead of dismissing people's decisions as ignorant or nonsensical, we can learn to make sense of the thinking behind them. Okay, and that's important. It's very tolerant. And what comes to my mind in these times is the vicious tribalism within the context of American society, which has become characteristic very tragically of American society, that people see each other not merely as adversaries, but as enemies, and are really closed off to encounter with contrary ideas. Okay, and I guess what I'm saying is that the virtue that you're talking about, which of course is necessary, seems to be more difficult than ever in terms of employing. We really seem to be separate, and there's a type of hostile gulf between different, let's call them political camps, or camps of different political ideologies, where people are not talking to each other at all. And I'm wondering, stepping away from your analysis and looking at this broad social political problem, how you look at that situation and whether you think there's any hope, or if there is, how indeed we can re-engage discourse, dialogue, communication, conversation with other people on the other side of the political divide. Big question, but I think one very critical to the moment. It might be hopeless for the time being. I don't know.
Right.
It really seems to be very daunting.
I think it's daunting, but I think, as Steve was just mentioning, there are ways to think about the other. One, as maybe not that far away from yourself, but more importantly, trying to understand them in order to bring them over to your side. One of the things, I work in a university, and so I see a lot of young activists, and so much of their activism is really about their identity. I am an activist. And it's not necessarily about social change. And I think that in order to be interested in social change, you have to change people. And you have to change people that don't think the way that you think, which means you can't get in their face and say you're wrong. You have to figure out and say, hey, maybe you want to think about it this way. Now, this is standard practice for activists who want to change the world. You look through history, people have done this. But I do think that sort of often how young people think about activism is about being right, not about changing minds. And so one of the things that we're really interested in is it's not about being, we have this slogan, do you want to be right or do you want to win? Because, you can be right, but unless you convince other people to come over to your side, we're never actually going to win. And so once you make that move, then it becomes, well, how do you win? The original title of this book was How to Win. It's kind of when we were playing with more of a self-help genre. And that once you ask yourself, well, I'm in it to actually change the world, then it really puts you in a position where you have to learn how to talk to people, particularly if you're on the left and we don't have the politicians, we don't have the money, we don't have the power. What we do have is we have creativity, and I think we can be persuasive and more persuasive than the folks on the other side.
Yeah, I was going to add to something I learned from Steve, which is there are always like a percentage of people that are actually like not worth dealing with, right? And to remember that, right? That they are very distracting because they're so over the top, but those are not the people that we're trying to engage. We're trying to engage like the majority of reasonable people that are not these extremes, right? And so, yes, you are free to dismiss super extremists, right? but then, yeah, there's, I think, a large number of people that can be persuaded if the information is presented in the right way, and with some creativity, and I think that on the right, and I learned this from Steve also, that they do some of this really well, unfortunately, right? So one thing about the tribalism, if you have right-wing opinions, like, there will be a bunch of people that will support you. There's a very active online community that when your family abandons you and everything else, that they will be there, right? And I'm not sure that's definitely meeting a need for people. I'm not sure what the sort of ethical equivalent is on the other side, but that's a thing that we can take inspiration for, right? Like, how do we support people that have these views and maybe their family doesn't share it, and we'll back you up, right? So that's one example, but I think too, there's a lot of opportunities to express frustration and anger. There's not a lot of analysis from what I've seen at like Trump rallies and stuff like that. And, so, okay, how do we give people the chance to express anger, but actually backed with some real analysis, and make that as compelling and exciting to watch as, I really do think they think of it as entertainment, and on the left, they don't think of themselves as entertainers. And you kind of need to a little bit. Like, you have to realize that you are doing, there's an element of that. There's an element of performance, right?
Yeah. So one of the essays that was really influential on our way of thinking about this is a really old one, William James's Moral Equivalent of War, in which William James gives a lecture to a bunch of Stanford students in 1915, I believe, who are pacifists. And he basically says, look, if you want to convince anybody that war is a bad idea, you have to acknowledge why they might think war is a good idea. And then once you engage their arguments, you move the point. But if we keep going at them by just saying war is bad and anybody who supports war is barbarous, then we're never going to convince those people. So find their argument and then figure out if we can create a moral equivalent.
Right.
Well,
he did write a famous essay, The Moral Equivalent of War.
That's the one we're thinking of.
Conservation. In other words, or actually there was a movement of summer camps called Camps William James.
I didn't know that.
Yes, that's right. They were based on James's essay that were devoted to conservation.
Right. Well, the CCC was kind of the state equivalent of that, right? So then Conservation Corps.
That's right. It was taking those values of struggle and so on and combat and sublimating them into, work in terms of conservation in the environment, which was sort of, I think, a brilliant strategy. Now, I want to talk one chapter that stood out to me, which I thought was very important. Really points to, if I've got it correctly, that the artistic activist approach, in effect, is ethically neutral. It can be used for good or ill, and your ethics have to come from the outside and basically infuse or inform the activism that you're doing. And of course, you give the paradigmatic case of Nazism that had mastered in powerful and frightening ways the appeal to pageantry, to theater, in order to arouse the German folk to the issue of the superiority of the Aryan people, and so on, and to Hitler's ideology, which was extraordinary. I mean, you watch those pageantry, the light and the dark, and so on, and the way in which the Nazis staged their rallies, and so forth. And you watch it today, and it's still blood-curdling in a way. It was quite something. And I think Hitler, if I'm right historically, basically based a great deal of Nazi pageantry on ancient Roman forms that, had similar motifs in terms of obeisance and worship of the emperor, and so on and so forth, and parades and, triumphs that the emperor had. And so you add both the Roman case, imperial case, and model, used as a model by Hitlerism. You had that type of theater, that type of art, but used for the most evil, nefarious purposes imaginable.
We can just never forget that Hitler was an artist. He thought of himself
Yes,
as
he
an
started
artist.
his career as
He started
a
his career as an
failed
artist.
artist. Yeah.
And he thought of himself as an artist till the end. There's a really fantastic book called Hitler and the Power of Aesthetics, which is all about looking at the Nazi movement as an aesthetic movement, and an absolutely evil movement. And that is why we think ethics are so important and why there's a chapter on ethics, not because we think people are going to become Nazis necessarily, but because even with the best intentions, it's sometimes easy to slip into unethical practices. And I think probably the one that we think about a lot is fear versus love, or fear versus hope. You can mobilize people with fear quite easily. And we've been brought in to work with Greenpeace because they were worried that they were slipping into this dystopic fear-based way of approaching people. And it's effective. It works. You scare the crap out of people and you get them to give you some money and get involved. But what sort of a world are you creating then? And so we always ask people, well, what kind of a world do you want to bring into being? And do your acts and the emotions you're mobilizing fit into that world? Because this is powerful stuff. Anytime you deal with emotions, it is powerful stuff. And so the ethics are absolutely key to this.
Right.
We also, the whole book, we tried to make as practical as possible. So there are things in there, because we find a lot of people that are new to this practice are afraid of doing it wrong and maybe inadvertently hurting someone. And it's like, all right, here's some stuff you can ask yourself, right? Like, and one of my favorites is act as if everyone will find out what you've done and that you did it, and every plan that it's all going to come out. And if you're worried, then what are you worried about? And maybe that's something you need to change, right? Yeah. Now there's a difference between surprise and lack of transparency, but we're talking about lack of transparency of people never knowing that you did this one thing or something.
My favorite, Steve, you came up with was, imagine explaining it to your mom. Yeah, how would she feel about what you were doing? And I was just thinking about your mom, the ex-nun, in this case,
Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess we're going to have to bring this really engaging discussion to a close, unfortunately. But I did want to sort of end with, I have two questions, one pertaining to the book and one goes beyond the book. You mentioned, Steve Duncombe, the notion of dystopia and not wanting your activism to be dystopic in a way. And then you end your book with a chapter, interestingly enough, on utopia and basically guiding your activism in terms of utopian visions. And I'm wondering whether you can comment on that. Let me play just for a second the devil's advocate. I used to be a utopian when I was in the 60s and so forth. I'm not a utopian anymore. I guess I got to say honestly, I'm sort of a political incrementalist. And one of the dangers of utopia is that your idea of perfection will never be reached, and therefore it can be at best in perhaps a reason for despair, or if you hold out utopian visions, those who don't conform to your utopia, like the world of perfect communism, can become expendable very easily. So there's a certain, history has shown that maybe there's a certain danger to utopian thinking, and yet you look at it in a benign way with regard to guiding and inspiring the activist. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the necessity from your standpoints of a utopian vision with regard to inspiring or standing in front of before your activism and so forth.
Sure. I'll let Steve talk about the guiding principle, but before he does, our notion of utopia is deeply rooted in Thomas More's Utopia. And Thomas More's Utopia, it's very important. And for my sins, I edited an edition of Thomas More's Utopia. And
well, it's doing penance, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's a very particular book and peculiar book insofar as he holds utopia up as an ideal and then constantly undercuts it, the most famous way by calling it no place, right? But throughout the entire book, he constantly says, here's a place, it's wonderful, and it doesn't exist. It won't exist. And so we like that play with utopia. Conjure it up as a vision, but know that it's not a place we're going to get. It's a direction that we need to go towards. And that keeps the utopia from becoming sort of the actually existing socialism, and off to the gulag with you if you don't think it's actually, socialism. But that point on the horizon that we never quite get to is actually key. I'm going to turn over to Steve to talk about why is it important to have that sort of ridiculous, phantasmagorical ideal.
Yeah, I think it infuses your actions with the world that you're trying to create, right? Like it can, when you have take something that's like so extreme and fantastic, and then you have the everyday reality that you're in that we're not ignoring, but we're creating a gap between the two, and your brain will kind of want to fill them in, right? It's like, no, this isn't possible. We have to do this, but maybe we could, and combine them. And as far as the incremental thing, so what I'm saying is it inspires ideas, but it also helps you move forward, right? And I don't remember which chapter this chart is in. It might be the process one, but it might be Utopia, where we have like, aim really high, try to get there, but also know that have what's the least you'll accept, and that there's the spectrum of success. It's not just reaching here. It's like this whole array of things that can happen that would be acceptable, that would move us forward. And we call it, like a double standard. Yeah, of course, it's a double standard. We have a standard up here and we have one down here, but it's good, because it allows you to dream big and accept, anything that falls short.
Yeah, good. Actually, I have two questions. One takes it beyond your book, but it's something that I simply can't get beyond. I think that at the moment, I'm not an alarmist, but I'm very worried, as many people are, about two great existential questions. One is climate destruction, right? Mm-hmm. Which is going to involve a great deal of political will on a global level, but of course, a lot of activism on the ground that hopefully will trickle on up to the global domain. And the other one that I'm extremely worried about, more immediate, is the demise of democracy in America. Mm-hmm. I think, I'm not an alarmist, but it's hard for me now at the moment to find the empirical resources and facts that will ensure that within 4 years, the American experiment will not come to an end. And I'm just wondering, maybe it's not a fair question, but it's something that's inescapable and more critical, as I see it, than any other issues that we confront, as we never have before, to this extent. And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about that and how your deployment of artistic activism can really work to save the planet and save American democracy. That's a utopian sort of prospect, but I'm wondering how you relate to the current I think are the most pressing issues of the day.
Sure, and I'll start with the easy one, leave Steve the hard one. About democracy, I think in some ways, the crisis of democracy has shown us what we need to do about democracy. We can't assume democracy. We have to sell democracy. We have to, and I'm a big fan, abandoned book up there, was about the communication and propaganda of the New Deal. And that there really has to be, I think part of the problem is we just assumed American democracy. We will be a democracy. And I think the rise of Trump and Trumpism really showed us that it is a fragile system. And that doesn't mean then that we then turn around and say, well, they're fascists and let's go back to democracy. We have to sell democracy. We have to make a convincing, emotional argument about why democracy matters. Because for most people, they don't see it. To be honest, I'm not sure I see it except as an abstraction. We need to bring it into life. We always think about that one of the things that artistic activism can do the best is it can take ideals and animate them into performances.
I hate to say it, and I hate to say it, and I don't mean to be patronizing it, I say it from a position of safety, but the war in the Ukraine basically highlights what authoritarianism looks in its raw awfulness.
Yeah.
And that might be a vehicle for restoring a commitment and enchantment, talking about pageantry writ large, in effect, an enchantment, re-enchantment with liberal democracy in America, conceivably. I hate to use that as
no. I think that's right. And what we need to do is move away from the negative and create the positive. Right? I think there's a lot of negative examples, the dystopian advances. What is democratic utopianism?
Right. Okay, one final question, real briefly. I see that we have some questions in the chat, and I want to get to some of our viewers before we sign off. What projects are you doing next? What's on your agenda?
We're working on democracy.
Well, good for you. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad we have
Yeah.
allies.
Because
Thank you.
the solutions to both those things that you mentioned are long and are going to require some experimentation and some innovation and some new
Good for
new
you.
ways.
Great. That's great.
So yeah, so for the next few years, we're working on democracy, and we're
Super.
yeah
Okay.
in the
Glad to
United
hear it.
States.
Great.
And
Okay.
we have workshops that are around the book. We're calling the Art of Activism Learning Labs, and the first one, I'm actually one of the trainers, and we're having these new trainers from around the world lead them to help people kind of put the ideas into practice in their own lives. So, and they're free. So,
Are those online or are they in person?
no, they're online, and yeah, you'll join people from around the world. The deadline for one is pretty soon, but we're going to have others, and it's you can find out more.
Maybe if you can send them in to Andrew at
Yeah.
Puffin, we can put them up there, right? That's great. Okay, let me go to the chat. I think we've got some
Sure.
some questions. This looks like a big one. Hold on. Okay. Two questions from the audience and myself. Who's myself? Is that Andrew? You mentioned that students often see activism as a matter of self-identity. It seems, quote, identity politics, end quote, at both a personal level and a more macro political level is a force difficult to avoid in these times. What is your take on this? Is this a good thing, bad thing? How does it affect how to engage in creative activism? That's the first question. The second question from Puffin Cultural Forum's Andrew Lee, that's our Andrew, is when I ask young artists coming out of art school to provide context, written or even verbal, I often find a hesitancy from them to claim social political meaning to their works. In particular, I remember having a show with women artists and the younger artists declining to call themselves or their works as being feminist. Is there some sort of tension or pushback against activist art from young artists coming out of art schools? Well, I don't know. Got that question? So there are two questions. The first one about identity politics, and the second one about pushback against activist art coming from young artists coming out of art schools. Either of you want to take those?
I could try the first one, Steve, and maybe you could add to it. But in my experience with students, I teach at SUNY Purchase, and which is its own place. But is that I think they're often like getting their start on and like trying to figure out where they stand on stuff and then see injustice and want to take it on. We have been talking recently at the Center for Artistic Activism about how most activism starts with anger. Anger is the input, but it can't always be the output, right? But in the beginning, when you start, it's like, this made me mad. And of course, your response is, I'm mad, and I'm going to tell people how mad I am. Eventually that, and when you don't know how to channel it into something that could change the situation, it's obvious. It's like, this is again understanding the audience. Like that's of course what they would do, and then you also have people that are literally, establishing their identity. So this is like, I'm upset about this, and that's part of who I am. But for me, what's always been really helpful is to say, okay, you're upset, and you don't like this. What do you want to see happen? And then what would happen after that? And what would happen after that? And like start to help them figure out a campaign and figure out what they actually really want. And then help show them how they can work towards that. I think this is why this kind of book is needed. Like activism and artistic activism are folk arts, like they're not taught. And if they are, they're often not taught very well. And so, it just exemplifies, I think, the need for that kind of training that's really sympathetic to where they are in their lives,
About identity politics is, politics always comes from our identities. And I think what we think of as identity politics comes out of the experiences of people who felt that politics didn't represent where they were in the world and what their experiences were. And so, I embrace that sense of identity. Of course, it's going to come from one's identity. The question goes back to what Steve was saying, is where does one move from there? Particularly because in order to wrest power, one has to be able to create some sort of coalitions, alliances with people who don't share your identity. And so if you're really serious about actually changing and challenging power, it means you have to move outside of your identity without losing your identity. You can start there, but then the question is move out. I think the question about the feminist young women artists who resist the label of feminism, in some ways, my hunch is they're not resisting what we think of as feminist practices or ideologies. They're resisting the label of being a feminist artist. And I think for good reason. We often talk at the Center for Artistic Activism that there is art which is about politics, and then there is art which actually works politically. A lot of what we think of as political art, it's in the Whitney Biennale and so on and so forth, or in the textbooks as feminist art, is art about political movements, or art is about positionality, or art which is about some sort of injustice. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it actually works politically. And once you wrap your head around, oh, I'm interested in art that works politically, not art about politics, it opens up the terrain of what you want to call yourselves, whether you want your art to be mimetic or prophetic. Do you want it to be representative, or maybe abstraction is the thing that's going to move people politically? It opens the terrain and keeps political art out of being this sort of shrill, look at this, it's bad.
Right.
The first interview I gave ever, they said, oh, you're making activist art or something. I was like, no, I'm not. Because I was like, I'm just an artist, and like I can do whatever I want, I did not want to be classified. And I think, I often think back, I'm around people in their early 20s a fair amount, and like how dumb I was. And they're so much smarter in a lot of ways. But, I needed people to give me some latitude and time and like understand where I was at. And I think there's some ideas in this book that can help with that.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place to end. This has been an absolutely illuminating, engaging, inspiring, and enjoyable conversation. It's really marvelous. And I want to encourage, again, our viewers to get a hold of The Art of Activism. It's a beautiful book. It's really very beautifully illustrated as well. And yet there are all kinds of pictures in it. But it's also, I found, actually very it's very intellectually, I found it intellectually stimulating as well. There are a lot of concepts and ideas about art and activism that are rather high-minded, despite the cartoons and the illustrations. And, that was a bit of a surprise. Yeah. I wasn't exactly expecting that level of discourse in this book, but I found myself very challenged. I thought it was intellectually highly respectable. And I think saying something very, very important with regard to political activism and humanizing it in a way that we absolutely need. So I want to thank you for the book and for your work, for putting yourself on the correct side of history in these regards, and for being our guests this afternoon at the Puffin Cultural Forum. I want to thank Steve Lampert and Steve Duncombe, both for the Center for Artistic Activism. I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank our viewers for being with us this afternoon. We're on YouTube. If you missed part of it, you can catch it again. It's there forever. It's part of the artistry of the internet, I guess. And it's been great seeing you and great having you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks.
And thanks to the Puffin Foundation for hosting us.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good afternoon.
All right.
Right. Bye-bye.
Take care.